Hi guys, I want to welcome you to episode 100 of the Revive Stronger podcast. What a journey it has been. I can still remember episode number 1 in which we interviewed Mike Israetel and James Hoffman, and I was with Mike Samuels, and never did I think the podcast would take the direction it has and explode in the way it has. And I just want to briefly say a massive thank you to all of you who watch the podcast and support it, share it, tag me on Instagram, and enjoy the podcast, asking your questions and things like this. So, massive thank you there. And I want to massively thank also all of the guests we've had on the show. There's been numerous experts from Mike Israetel to Brad Schoenfeld, James Krieger, everyone, and more to come. I also want to give a very short and special thank you to Pascal Floor, who came onto the Revive Stronger team as a coach, but also edits all the podcasts and makes sure they're of the highest quality of sound and visual. So give him a thank you as well. I also want to have just a quick message to you to keep your eyes peeled for a potential hypertrophy seminar with Jared Feather and Mike Israetel coming in the near future. And also to let you know that we will be starting up a Patreon account just as a way so we can have a little bit of potential income and you can support us in keeping out this tremendous content. So there will be links to that below. So without further ado, look forward to listening to 3 amazing, very expert individuals on a very interesting topic. So cheers guys, take care and revive stronger. Awesome. So hi guys, welcome to the Revive Stronger podcast. I'm your host as always, Steve Hall, and we have a very special roundtable. Hopefully everything will hold for the podcast. We have Eric Helms, Mike Israetel, and Menno Henselmans with us today, and I'm super excited to have all 3 of them. I have to give them a massive thank you for being here today and bearing with me. So without further ado, we'll get straight into it because we have kind of hopefully technology on our side at the moment. And we're going to go into the topic of deloads, and we're going to start with Eric to define what a deload is and why they're used for kind of physique competitors, and we'll roll from there. So go for it, Eric.
Cool. Thanks for having me for sure, Steve. So yeah, in its basic form, a deload is also sometimes called a taper. And that is essentially, probably in its most basic form, a period of reduced training stress to allow for the dissipation of fatigue, which typically accumulates faster than the actual performance increases that you're getting from training. Specifically for a physique competitor, they're not well defined, at least not in the literature. You can find you can find new emerging recent research on what is probably a good way to taper for maximal strength, which is essentially a maintenance of intensity and frequency and a reduction in volume, somewhere between 1 to 2/3 of what you're normally doing, or maybe a slight reduction in intensity. And that depending on how you look at that, that could be a maintenance of load. So like percentage of 1RM while dropping the number of reps performed. So the RPE could go down during a taper. However, I think that has limited application for a physique athlete. That's probably something you'd want to do before, say, testing your performance to see if you've actually made progress. But since you don't actually care about whether or not your strength is going up, rather it's just an indicator that you are indeed getting bigger, you might want to consider other ways of reducing training stress. So for example, reducing load a little bit as well, as you might just want to take some time to reduce joint loading, and you don't have a requirement to maintain peak strength levels as you start, say, a new mesocycle of training. So I think it's not clearly defined in the literature what a deload looks like for physique competitors, but broadly, from what we do know of overall the way the body adapts, it's just a period of reduced stress training to allow for the dissipation of fatigue.
Brilliant. And I think everyone kind of has a good idea of what deloads are in general, kind of when people are thinking about it, but I think it's really good to have that clear definition. I know you all kind of are along the same thoughts on the definition. I don't think it's really something that's massively up for debate. But I think some of you have, well, all of you, I think, have slightly different ways in which you do periodize. And I'd love to hear Menno's Thoughts on kind of deloads for physique athletes and how you go about kind of implementing them with your clients and yourself?
Sure. Yeah, I tend to stick to the literal definition of deloading. So I fully agree with Eric here on the abstract definition, basically. So I'd say a deload is a period in which you literally reduce training loads. That's how I most commonly define it. So either you don't train at all, so you literally reduce the loads by 100%, or you reduce the training loads and train, with submaximal weights. I know there are other ways you can do it, and we could use different terminology for that, but that's the term I would use for the literal meaning of a deload. So the typical, most concrete deload, if some people are still wondering, what does this exactly look like in practice? I would say that the most common thing I see as deloading is probably the block periodization, where you have 3 weeks where you accumulate volume, and then you take the 4th week off training, or it's super low load, very submaximal training, like doing your warm-ups and using weights that are probably too low to induce any further muscle growth or strength development. So that's the application, at least I've seen most often, of a deload, like a full week off or very reduced training loads. And my approach is very different to how I recommend deloads for physique athletes. So I'm not sure if you want to go into powerlifting and the like as well, but we can do that separately because I use different methods for that. But for physique competitors, I'm not a fan of just taking a whole week off every, X weeks, but rather using what I call reactive deloads. So my beef with the full week off for physique competitors is that, for one, it's arbitrary. So, you have to decide for which period are you going to take some time off. Well, that's hard because you don't know exactly when someone is going to need the deload. Things like stress and sleep can make a huge impact on someone's recovery capacity. So you don't know when someone's partner is going to break up with them and they're going to have a lot more life stress, or they're just going to have really bad sleep, or work's going to be more intense, stuff like that, and that can impact their recovery capacity a lot. And maybe they need a deload at that time, but they don't need it when you've planned it in January, and actually they're on holiday and everything's fine, and they could actually probably up the training volume. So that's one thing I think that an ideal deload should take into account. It shouldn't be arbitrary, but there should be a rationale for when you do it. And a reactive deload, as I typically use them, is that you don't set the deload in advance, so it's not proactive, but it's reactive. So you see when someone's performance isn't as planned, and then you react by reducing the training loads. So if you have a certain program and you expect at a certain time point that they are going to squat 140 kilos for 8 reps, and you see that they only get 4 reps, well, that might be an indication that they have overreached, they haven't recovered yet. So what I then do is I cut the training loads by a large percentage and just have them do speed work. Very simple version would be just skip all remaining sets of that exercise. 2 other reasons why I like that form of reactive deloading, so it's exercise specific and reactive rather than proactive, is that, like I said, for one, it's exercise specific. So we know that muscle growth and muscular adaptations and fatigue are largely a local process. So it doesn't make sense that if you're, everyone has weak body parts, stronger body parts. For me, for example, I have the elbows and knees of a 6-year-old girl. So they are very prone to being overtrained. And at various time points, I may need to cut down on the volume for arm work, leg extensions, squats, that kind of stuff. But I can keep hammering my hips, my delts all year. Like there's basically nothing that I can do to overtrain or damage my hips. Like I've never ever had any kind of hip problem. I can do high volume, high intensity sumo deadlifts all year. Never going to be a problem. Recovery for my delts just never seems to be an issue. So it makes sense to me that you would schedule the deload to be muscle or exercise specific based on individual joint tolerance, muscle groups that recover faster and slower than others based on someone's genetics and maybe other factors. The last factor would be the time course of the deload. So a reactive deload is typically one session, and then maybe there's a specification of what to do the next session. So in the example of the squat, I typically have them, when after a deload, I have them go back in weight one increment being the smallest amount of weight, typically 5 pounds or 2.5 kilos. That's possible with someone's equipment. You guys still there? Yeah, okay. So the time course is really short. It's basically 1 microcycle, mesocycle, depending on your terminology, of reduced training stress. And the reason for that is that I think there's a lot of literature. There's not much literature on deloading specifically, but there is literature on the time course of recovery from certain exercise. And a few studies that come to mind, there was a recent one. It was 4 sets of bench pressing, pretty high rep work to failure, 4 sets to failure. And most people recovered within 48 hours, with some more on 72 hours. And there's also a study on rugby players that did like a full body protocol, pretty intense, kind of typical session they would perform in the off season. And it was also, most people recovered, I think all of them actually, statistically at least, within 72 hours. So I think there's a lot of literature pointing to even pretty extreme kind of protocols will need, maybe 5 days or so of recovery, but a full week of recovery is a long ass time to actually require your muscles to keep recovering for that whole period. So that's basically why I don't recommend like the typical kind of Poliquin-esque week off every 4th week, but rather do it reactively for certain exercises when needed. And that's basically how I typically use deloads for physique competitors.
Okay, fantastic. And I think for the kind of brevity of this podcast, we'll keep it to physique competitors, and that's really interesting. So reacting specifically to certain muscle groups is certainly an interesting way to deload. And I know Mike has probably a different perspective on this, and I think I'll open the floor next to Mike if you want to kind of go over, maybe address Menno's approach and kind of talk about the way you like to do things, and then we can open the floor to maybe Eric and have a thought in the middle of those.
Cool. Thanks so much. Pleasure speaking with such bright young gentlemen. That gives me hope for the world's future. That you folks are around. And yeah, I'm running for political office, so I'm practicing my politics.
How old are you, Mike?
Say what?
How old are you?
What do you think was a hairline test? I'm 48.
Oh,
51.
Wow. Really?
No.
Really? Like seriously?
How could you believe that, man? That's fucked up. I'm 33.
Okay, so I'm actually older than everyone else in this podcast. We'll just carry on then.
Well, Captain America's grouchy today, folks. Aren't you technically like 95 then?
Does your time frozen in stasis count? I don't think so. So,
all right.
Which also is a problem with my drug-free status, because technically that means I took super serum not too long ago.
That's true. That's very true. You got to stretch that out. All right. So, I think a lot has been covered, and I agree with most of it. I have a couple of things to add. I think that when we look at it from a big picture theoretical view, we can talk about just the term active recovery, which is all-encompassing and includes 3 basic kinds of active recovery, one of which, the intermediate of which, is usually called the deload. The first is just called a light session or recovery session, and that's what I think Eric and Menno are more apt to doing more of, which is when your performance starts to dip down, then you take 1 to several lighter sessions. And the light session is, unfortunately, we actually like to call it a recovery session at RP, because light session indicates that the load is always manipulated. That's not always the case. As Eric mentioned, sometimes it's the volume. I think it's pretty clear that volume is the predominant cause of fatigue, and the reducing volume is the predominant way to alleviate fatigue. You can still actually train with higher loads for most kinds of fatigue. I'll get to what I mean by that in just a bit. But basically, you make training fundamentally easier for a session to several sessions. That allows you to recover enough to continue to provide overload sequentially over the next several days and or weeks until you have to repeat the process again. So that's session level active recovery. Then there is a microcycle level active recovery phase, which is typically called the deload. That's when you take a reduced volume and intensity for an entire microcycle, which is typically a week. And then you come back and usually restart a new mesocycle after that, oftentimes changing some sorts of variables in your block periodized scheme, maybe rep range or exercise selection, or you keep everything the same, but you recycle the load somewhat, just get a little bit further away from RIR to basically increase your repetitions in reserve to start working your way towards higher relative intensities again. And the deload does a little bit something more special, a little bit different qualitatively than simply taking light sessions in sequence, particularly with structures that require, or systems that require, longer times to heal. For example, the nervous system, and more particularly joint structures, do not simply heal after several sessions. And with joint structures in particular, I'll get this in just a bit, they can oftentimes be relatively asymptomatic until it's not so much too late, but until they're a real big problem. So that's, the deload does something a little bit qualitatively more than simply taking a couple of days easy with active recovery sessions. Lastly, is the an entire phase, right, of active recovery, or what's called the active rest phase, and that's often done with very high-level athletes who train more or less through the seasonal cycle. So like a soccer player will play like a really brutal season. After the season, you basically sequence anywhere between 2 and 4 deload blocks or deload weeks, one after another, to really fundamentally bring down a ton of joint fatigue, nervous system fatigue, and a lot of psychological fatigue that just takes longer than a week to get back. So all of these things are part, I think, at some point of most intelligent programs. And what I'll say is they all have their merits and demerits, and all are situationally a better or worse idea compared to the other two. I think that the autoregulation versus pre-planned debate is more of a, there's a place for both things. I think autoregulatory, or Menno, what was your term for it? Reactive, right? Reactive deloading, I think, is highly intelligent. It should be a part of almost every single, if not every single program. I think there are some slight exemptions to that, like with just raw beginners. They have no idea what's going on, so I'm not really interested in how they feel. But you know, like, oh, I'm tired, whatever, shut up, here's a program. But I think autoregulation, especially for high-level athletes, become very important. But there is something to say for pre-planned and modifiable, like you will take a deload week at some point. It may be, as you're accumulating fatigue, you average a 4-week accumulation phase with 1 week of deload. But at week 4, if you're still feeling pretty good, you can take a 5th week, but then you need a deload after the 6th, and a full week of less intense, less voluminous activity. One of the biggest reasons I think this is a necessity is because some systems, like I mentioned earlier, simply take longer to recover than your perception of effort and your ability to acutely exert effort. For example, if your joints are getting beat up literally in the sense that they're getting degraded and they're behind on the repertory processes, you may, not feel really much until you have actual micro trauma. And if you just do sort of reactive deloading, or you do just a couple of light sessions, your muscles heal relatively quickly, much faster than your joint structures do. And you'll just feel, you can replete glycogen in a couple of sessions really well. You're going to have baller workouts. You're going to be like, shit, I'm back. You'll be just strong enough after being back, if you keep doing that and never take a longer deload, to get yourself really hurt with your joints. And once your joints start hurting, you're in real deep shit, and you might need an entire active rest phase to heal everything, if not worse. Now, it's not always this bad, but generally speaking, I think every now and again, not nearly as often. I don't like the 3-to-1 paradigm much for physique athletes. I think that's ridiculous. I think for powerlifters that weigh 315 pounds and are lifting with equipment, for example, that are lifting 110% of their 1RM, yeah, 3-to-1 paradigm is a monster, and they do need an easy week after that. But I think physique athletes, especially training raw, especially training drug-free, I think they can train for 4 to 6 weeks, no problem, without the need for a true deload. And with autoregulation, maybe even longer. But I think a week at the end of that might be a very good idea, just to really just take all the burners off, really level the playing field, allow joint reconstitution, especially. Maybe some things about the nervous system, maybe a little bit of testosterone, cortisol kind of stuff, although per Menno's latest article, that's not looking as convincing as it once did. But really bringing everything down, really bringing fatigue down in a big way, especially in the ways we can't detect just through performance. And then you have more or less a clean slate to start ramping back up while auto-regulating over a longer term. And I think at least once a year, most individuals should take the equivalent of an active rest phase, For physique purposes, I think 2 weeks is more than sufficient for almost everybody. Higher level, older individuals like John Meadows, for example, are known for taking like a month of active rest after the competition season every year. But like when you're 45 years old and you've been doing this since you were 12, you're going to need that shit. So not to fall apart like Mr. Potato Head, but we definitely don't want to push the idea that everyone needs a month off once a year. And I think also something that a lot of personal trainers have brought to my attention, like when you have regular clients that are sort of physique-ish but aren't competitors, they'll active rest by their damn selves by accident. So you don't have to program that shit in. You're like, hey, good news, active rest coming up in January. And they're like, oh, good, I'm traveling in Europe all of January anyway. And you're like, well, fuck, I guess just fucking do that shit without me, man. Take me with you to Europe, please. I want to see the Eiffel Tower. I never have. So so in any case, those are kind of my views. So I think autoregulation is central to fatigue management, but I think some pre-planned fatigue management on the longer terms, multiple mesocycles especially, and every macrocycle or so, I think we have to really take a backseat, take a longer, lower volume, low intensity phase, especially for joint issues, deeper nervous system issues, and the accumulation of various hormones, etc. Sorry for rambling.
No, nice, brilliant. I think that was a really good, and we can segue to Eric, who hasn't spoken for some time. So I'm sure you've got some comments to make on both Menno and Mike's statements there.
Yeah, it's painful to listen to these two guys talk for so long, but it's happened, and we're here, and we're not better for it. But I'm going to try to recover that a little bit. No. Overall, I agree with both these guys. I think I'll address Menno first because he first spoke. In some ways, I agree with Menno. In some ways, I don't. I think, for one, while hypertrophy and the adaptation that we're trying to get for physique athletes getting bigger is a local process, just because the adaptation is local doesn't mean the training only affects local systems. The training we do to grow is affecting the entire complex system. So in that way, I agree with Mike that you need to look at the bigger picture in terms of recovery, and that there might be joint, nervous system, and probably more importantly, just psychological issues. I think a really good read for anyone listening is some of the periodization reviews written by John Keeley. John Keeley is a theorist who I really like because he always just comes in every 5 years and just kicks everyone in the ass and says, you're so dumb. Everything you're based on is based on stuff that we discarded in real science in the 50s, basically. And he discusses how we often look at stress and adaptation as these kind of very binary things. You input X, and then if you get a certain amount of recovery, you get Y. And in reality, it is much more complex than that. It's our perception of it and everything else in our life. Like Menno said, your partner breaks up with you, and that's going to affect how you recover from training. And it's while it's nice to be able to program a certain amount of training load and then go, right, we need X amount of recovery, and that should sort it. It just never plays out that way in real life. So in that way, I agree with Menno that you do need a reactive or an autoregulated approach to recovery from training. However, as a practitioner and an educator, I have a different approach to what I tell people. If I'm going to put something in a book that is going to be mass consumed by 10,000 plus people who I don't have an active hand in modifying their training, you better believe I'm going to tell them they need to do planned deloads, because especially the cultural way that we operate as bodybuilders is typically, even when we might say more is not better, we operate with kind of that intrinsic core belief that if I could just work harder, I'd be better. And by the way, I also kind of like pain a little bit, and I'm a little crazy, and I just want to go hard and go home. I don't care what all the science I'm saying. I just want to go hard and go home. That's basically what's really going on in kind of like the reptile brain of most bodybuilders. So that means that when I write a book, or if I'm talking on a podcast, I'm going to say, it's probably not a bad idea if you don't have a coach who's overseeing your training to take regularly planned deloads. Now, that said, when I'm actually working with an athlete directly, I pencil in deloads based on where I think they should need it based on the program I've written. And then it gets modified quite frequently because just like Menno said, stuff happens. People break up with you. You get in traffic, you learn that a political candidate got elected who you don't like. You need to find, a safe space. All kinds of things can destroy your ability to adapt to training. So So I think it's important to be able to modify them as a coach. I think it's also important to realize that your deload strategy should be related to your training strategy. And one thing that I don't think was well addressed was that a lot of what we're talking about is recovery from what just happened. And I think a lot of the times what we need to also be thinking about is preparation for what's to come. So while it is true that you might recover your performance acutely in 24, 48, 72, or 96 hours, if you're going into a higher volume mesocycle, you need to prepare yourself for that. And if you just jump in right out of the gates in week 1 and start doing high volume, you're going to accumulate so much damage to prevent your ability to adapt and perform on that newer high volume or higher intensity or just higher overload is probably a better way to generalize it program. So I think a deload between mesocycles is also quite useful in that you can use it as a preparatory period to elicit the repeated bout effect so you can handle the higher levels of training volume and intensity and overload that's coming in the new mesocycle. And I would also finally say, the last thing I want to add is that your ability to recover changes depending on the quality you're talking about, even in performance. So there was a study by Faria that came out just last year that showed in response to a high volume resistance training program, strength came back earlier before your ability to produce volume. So a single isolated AMRAP is not necessarily predictive of your overall ability to produce work, which I think is a pretty important thing for a bodybuilder, obviously. So, and that may be different if you had done a fatiguing high intensity protocol and then to see what performance came back. So there's a lot of there's a lot of things going on at the same time. Different performance recovers at different rates. Not only do deloads help you recover from what just occurred, but can help you to prepare what we call an intro cycle for the next mesocycle. And finally, I would agree there is a time and a place for a planned or penciled in autoregulated deload. And it really depends on who you're talking to. And I think it's important to realize that if you don't have a coach, you really shouldn't trust yourself unless you're a pretty damn experienced lifter.
Brilliant. I don't know if Menno, you have any kind of comments to make back to these two guys?
Sure, yeah. I think both have very reasonable perspectives. I'd like to go deeper into the different structures and systems that may require different time courses of recovery. Because I think we all agree that muscle tissue adapts quite rapidly. It's very plastic. And it's rarely the limiting factor for a deload, especially if you're talking about a time course of a week or longer. The muscle tissue is really the limiting factor. As for different systems having a different time course, I can definitely agree with that on connective tissue, joints, ligaments, maybe even bone, tendons. Tendons are well known to have quite poor recovery, especially when there is damage. It's actually debatable if tendon tissue can recover fully when a significant amount of damage has occurred, but when it ever really fully recovers. As for the nervous system, though, I think that won't be an issue. Like I wrote a recent article on that Mike also referenced, where I show that central nervous system fatigue. It's often bandied about as a term, but in the research we have, it's actually shown that it's mostly an acute effect, and over time there may actually be upregulation. So it seems to be that any central nervous system fatigue that occurs is largely within that workout, and within the time course, there was one study that looked at the time course, and it was like 20 minutes before it was gone. So you're not talking about hours, days, or weeks. You're literally talking about minutes. It's very possible, because there is one study, I think, that showed a longer time course of central nervous system fatigue, but that was with eccentric only exercise, which in that study induced probably a huge amount of muscle damage. And then there was still, on one measure of the several measures of central nervous system fatigue, still central fatigue 24 hours, but not on the other measures. So maybe that some aspects of the nervous system can take longer to recover from, but even in that case, I think the extent of muscle damage and local fatigue will be so much more severe than central fatigue that I'm very skeptical of the idea that there is any, at least that the central nervous system will require a longer time course of recovery than muscle tissue. Joints and ligaments, I can definitely agree with. The literature on that isn't very clear. To my knowledge, there isn't any good literature showing that for my given workout, tendon tissue has a longer time course of recovery than muscle tissue, for example. But it's definitely my experience that you can sort of accumulate an injury silently, and at some point it reaches a certain level. This iceberg theory is quite popular in physiotherapy, which says that basically tissue damage can occur, and it's only at a certain extent that it will actually start triggering your pain receptors. So you don't know whether you have damaged the tissue unless it triggers a pain receptor, nociceptor. So you can accumulate a certain injury, basically, or at least some tissue damage in a tendon or something before you actually feel it. So in that sense, I agree that there may be a rationale for it. However, my experience is that overuse injuries, when technique is good in a program and volume is reasonable, accumulates slowly. Like, it's very, very rare that you just have, boom, snap, that's your back, gone. That's deadlifts with a round back, but again, it's technique. With most exercise is just incredibly rare. I've had it once. My sacroiliac joint literally just popped during a squat. Like, good technique. Nobody even saw anything. It was just like, boom, couldn't move anymore, couldn't walk, couldn't do anything, just literally couldn't move. So, but that's incredibly, incredibly rare in my experience. And usually you see it coming. Like, it becomes an ache or stiffness or just a nagging kind of sensation. Or, when you get out of bed, it's like you don't really feel as flexible anymore. And when you pay attention to those signs, then you can still react to that. Switch up exercises. Often that has my preference over deloading in this case for injury management, switching exercises, increasing the repetitions, slowing down the tempo. These are ways that you still stimulate muscle tissue very effectively, but greatly reduce stress on the connective tissue. So that's how I typically like to manage injuries. Mind you, then the focus with my clients often is on maximum progression. So, if someone has a more laid back approach, then it might be more reasonable to just say, okay, you know what, just take the time off. We don't need to maximize every single session of time. But with my clients, I typically aim for maximum progression, especially competitors. And then I prefer using these other strategies to manage connective tissue or possible connective tissue injuries. And then again, do it very specifically, because like I said, for me, but many people, they have certain body parts that are very susceptible to connective tissue injuries, but other body parts that are definitely not. And certain exercises are almost universally well tolerated. For example, most hip extension movements in people that don't have very weak hips tend to be very, very rare to cause damage, whereas other exercises are simply very susceptible to induce damage. Notorious ones are anything behind the neck, dips. Basically, all three of the power lifts are quite susceptible to result in injuries at some point, as long as you push the volume up high enough for long enough. But other exercises, like if someone doesn't have injury-prone shoulders, simple lateral raises, dumbbell lateral raises, rarely result in injury. So I think it's also, you have to decide basically what your risk tolerance is in that regard, and if you want to proactively take a week off, or try to manage it more acutely and try to keep pushing, but realizing that you are taking some risk when you do this.
Awesome. And I don't know if you guys are happy that we've kind of covered the training aspect there, or I don't know if Mike's got any comments to make on what Menno's just said there, or if you guys are happy to talk about potentially going into the nutritional aspect of deloading.
I'd like one comment.
Go for it.
If that's okay. So there's a potential problem that I see, and I've witnessed it myself numerous times, a theoretical problem that ends up becoming practical, with the consistent employment of exclusively autoregulation based on performance to continue to progress. So taking 1 or 2 light sessions, maybe half a week, and then coming back and hitting it again and doing that. To use my pedantic nomenclature, maximum recoverable volume, right? I think we're all kind of familiar with what that is at this point. This is just the most volume your physiology can handle before it can't recover anymore. I think what a lot of times ends up happening is the reason that we need an autoregulatory reduction is that we exceed our body's maximum ability to recover temporarily. And then we need to bring back the training loads to some extent training stimulus in order to recover. What that ends up doing in many cases, especially for individuals that are relatively high level, is it brings them just back under their maximum recoverable volume and buys them like another several sessions perhaps of accumulation, productive overloading training, until they're back in that danger zone again and they need to go backwards. What that results in, if it goes too far, is a poor ratio of accumulation to deloading, which is essentially the ratio of your stimulative overloading training versus your recovery time can get as close as 1-to-1. And that's not really that good. So I think there is some argument there for every now and again bringing back the training volume for a longer time, maybe a week, really reducing fatigue to get yourself back into a position where you can go much longer. You can buy yourself more time of productive overload accumulation, weeks instead of days, so that you can consistently train, and your accumulation to deload ratio ends up better if you just take some good time at the lower end of things, kind of invest a good time. It's almost like, if I was to make an analogy, it would be like, if you are working on a really big research project and you have like a week to finish it, if you only take like a 30-minute break here and there, you buy yourself just enough time and sanity to work for another hour maybe. And then after an hour, you're sort of fucking have no idea what your name is, and you need another 30-minute break. It ends up being like, a 2-to-1 ratio of work to rest. But if you were to simply take an entire day of leisurely running around holding your lover's hands through the meadows of Morocco, perhaps, then you may actually buy yourself 4 baller-ass consistent days of grinding, brutal work. That's a better ratio. That's 4-to-1. And I think it pays off in the end. Now, of course, this can be taken too far, but I think within reason, there's some argument for that. And we can use reps in reserve as a really just a simple illustration of that. So if you're like 1 rep in the tank, and then you take a couple of light sessions, you get back to 2 reps in the tank. Within several overloading sessions, you're back to 1 rep in the tank again, or 0 reps, and you kind of have to just bring it down again. But if you go all the way down, bring enough fatigue to where you're 4 reps in the tank, it's going to take weeks to get back up with successive overloads to get to 1 rep in the tank again. So it buys you more training time. So that I think that, and I'm actually not saying that either one of these two guys are fans of that method of doing things, but I think some individuals I've seen kind of, and to sort of take a page from Eric's book, the go hard or go home combines with an abuse of autoregulation, where they're like, wait a minute, I could just autoregulate everything. So I'm going to smash my shit into fucking millions of pieces, take a light session or 2, be just good enough to survive another smashing, and then I'm going to take my dick out, hit it with a hammer, good old-fashioned barbell training, just like Grandpa used to do. And then what ends up happening is they never mind the fact that I think they're risking long-term injury and all the other bad stuff from fatigue accumulation, because they're always chronically in an almost overreach state. I don't think it's good to hang out around your MRV for a long time. But if nothing else, they're just not getting the overload, the accumulation to deload ratios that they could be. And that's not, and it literally is not, it's just I guess more for the listener, because I'm not saying either one of the other folks advocate this. I just have seen this approach. We've all seen like the standard abuse of the deload thing is like when a client feels fucking incredible, let's say they're female and a relative, like an intermediate, they could do 8 weeks of accumulation before ever needing a deload. And the coach is like, 3-to-1, baby, you got a week off. And they're like, a week off for what? I don't feel shit. They're like, nope, you got to do it, because otherwise you'll break in half. On the other hand, right, that's the abuse of pre-planned strategies. The abuse of autoregulation can sometimes be that buying yourself just another session to barely stay alive.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, can I make one quick comment there? I fully agree with that. I think that is also something I observe routinely in practice, that I think it is, what I'd say though, is it is key to separate injury management and the need for muscular deloading. So I definitely agree that you don't just want to use the deloads like short-term reactive deloading for injury management, because if you notice that you're on a certain volume of bench pressing, and that volume is leading to an injury slowly over time, and then you take 1 deload session, and then you're good to go for a few sessions, but that volume is causing an injury. So unless something changes in your lifestyle that improves your recovery capacity, it's going to lead to another injury. And I see that very often in people that indeed, if you just do like one deload, that is not sufficient for injury prevention. So I think you really need to take a different method there. And one method could be that you have blocks. I think this is especially suitable for powerlifters because they have no choice, right? They will need to train the power lifts and they will need to use high intensities basically. So they don't have much of a choice. And then I think deloading is very reasonable. But for bodybuilders, you can just change exercise, or you may determine that that volume is just too much for that body part, maybe even including the muscles. So in my experience, purely anecdotal, because I don't think there is research directly on this, but it is very strongly my experience with my clients and myself that within certain body parts, the strength of the connective tissue correlates quite strongly with muscular adaptive potential. So typically, you see that if someone has really strong elbows that never get injured, they probably have good arms, as in size and or potential for size at least. And they probably also can train their arms with quite a high volume. Whereas if you see that someone like me has really shitty elbows that are very easy to injure, then they probably also don't want to train their arms with much volume, even if they can do so without getting injured. Again, purely my observation, not based on research. But I think there is definitely something there. We do know that frame size, which is also joint size, but often measured via wrist circumference or ankle circumference, more practically, correlates with muscular potential. So I think there is something there, that there is a relation between muscular potential, resistance to injury, and volume tolerance for the muscles as well as the connective tissue.
Fantastic. Has anyone got any statements to make after Menno's there? No? Happy? Awesome. Really, really interesting discussion and fantastic. I think the listeners will love that. And I think we've covered off the training aspect really, really well. And how's everyone doing for time? Are you all okay?
Good to go, man.
Awesome. We're going to open the floor to nutrition then, because obviously we've talked about training, and a big part of our recovery and fatigue management is the nutrition that we're going to take within our bodies. So I don't know who wants to kind of talk about nutrition first of all, if Eric hasn't spoken for some time. So we'll start off with Eric. How do you like to approach kind of nutrition within your deload? Yeah, go for it.
Well, I think I probably should have done a better job defining what actually the deload looks like. So this makes sense. Like, while Mike definitely said like a 3-to-1 ratio of training to work is not a good idea, or sorry, training to deloading is not a good idea. I think it also depends on what that deload looks like. Like if you read muscle and strength pyramids, I often have 3 build-up weeks and then 1 light week. But the light week is like 1 less set, and you're still working in a similar RPE range. I would actually argue that there's probably still some adaptive stimulus there. It's more of kind of a just in case, because you're probably going higher than the RPEs I even have programmed for you. Conservative approach of allowing it. It's not like taking a week off. And so anyway, I typically don't alter nutrition very much at all during a deload phase. For one, the caloric expenditure of weight training is very low. And you're probably burning more on a day where you went grocery shopping and didn't work out than a day where you didn't go grocery shopping and lifted weights, unless you just did something that bodybuilders aren't doing or shouldn't be doing. So from just a pure energy balance perspective, I think sometimes trying to match your surplus level to your daily activity changes is an exercise in futility. You don't actually know what it is. And it's probably just more realistic, in my opinion, just to look at kind of longer term changes in body mass anyway. So, 1 to 2 pounds a month, depending on your training age. And you can listen to the other debate between good and evil that's going to come out soon that Abel hosted, for hearing myself and Mike argue about how to bulk. But anyway, so since we're chasing a small surplus, if we're talking about drug-free physique athletes who are relatively experienced, which they should be if they're a physique athlete, and if we're looking at a deload where the energy expenditure is talking maybe 50 calories different from a day where you're doing a couple additional sets, and there is some adaptive stimulus, even though it's quite low, or at least maintenance, I don't have any issue with just keeping nutrition exactly the same. But I can completely understand if someone has a different training paradigm, that would be altered.
And just to check, Eric, that's the same if you're in a bulk cut, whatever you're doing, you just keep it level through that deload week.
You know, cuts are interesting because I might have someone, the biggest source of stress during a contest prep diet is not training. It is all the effects of the diet itself and all the things that occur, loss of body fat, the energy deficit, et cetera. So while I might give someone a diet break where they're taking 1 to 2 weeks on maintenance calories or close to it, during that period, they can also handle a higher training stress. So I'm typically giving them a higher voluminous block of training, or I should say microcycle or two of training during a diet break, or allowing them to really, go for it if they want in the gym in terms of loads, unless they are super beat up. And then sometimes I will concurrently program a light week of training along with a diet break. But if I'm doing my job, and typically that doesn't happen in the first place, but you don't always have, I don't get to, live life with my clients. Sometimes they'll come to me and tell me they've been doing some crazy shit, and then a family member died or something like that or whatever. And then that may necessitate that call. But I would just say that during a diet, training is not the thing that is most stressful. And typically, even though training is very important, I don't think it's an interesting paradigm. During a diet, a lot of people drop volume. The rationale is that your recovery capacities are lower, so you can't recover from the same amount of volume. Paradoxically, at the same time, you also need the volume to maintain your muscle mass. So I think the amount of stimulus you need to grow has not changed when you're dieting. However, you just can't recover from it. So you kind of have to play that game carefully. Typically what I do is I reduce volume as needed, especially from the most stressful movements. So a great way to do it is drop a set off squats or deadlifts or something like that, or your surrogate movements for those, versus just dropping volume across the board. And I do it a little more reactively when I'm coaching. Again, if you listen to me talking in the Shredded by Science Academy, or if you listen to me read my books, I talk about like a 10% reduction every 12 weeks or something like that in volume. But again, that's because I'm writing it for people and I don't have an active hand in manipulating their training. And I think deloads are probably more important during contest prep because it's, let me, if I can state this again, I think taking too reductionist of a look at recovery and deloads is probably a mistake. We have to look more holistically at how the person is feeling and how burnt out they are from training. And they're going to be generally more burnt out, and they have to psych themselves up more to perform at the same level during prep as they might in the off season. So just telling them, hey, this week, don't worry too much about the loads. Let's just get it in. So long as you're in the ballpark of X, Y, and Z, like we already talked about, that can be a great source of reduction of stress overall. I remember driving and listening to loud music for 20 minutes just to get ready to do like 4 sets of squats sometimes in contest prep. And then in the off season, I get to the gym and I look at my phone to figure out what I programmed. I go, oh, I got squats. So it's a very different mentality the whole day. And throughout the whole prep. So I think deloads are sometimes more effective in prep, even though the training stress is not providing the primary stress. It's just because everything's a little more stressful. So I kind of got way off base there and probably took up more time than needed and didn't really answer your question. But overall, I don't manipulate nutrition much during a deload. Thank you.
No, perfect. And I think I'll move over to Mike to have some comments on that, or how you structure nutrition over a deload. Sorry.
Sure. I don't know if it's wise to bring this up currently. And Steve, if you don't want this discussion here, that's perfectly understandable. So just let me know if this is not something you want to engage in, and we can just table it for another time. There seems to be this general aura in the evidence-based community that when you are cutting, that you are supposed to maintain intensity at the expense of volume. You're supposed to try to still lift as heavy as possible while dropping volume considerably. To me, this goes against the main thrust of the literature, especially of late, that volume is the most causative and correlative measure to hypertrophy. And also, you need quite a bit more fatigue dissolution to occur to hit your best intensities, but not nearly as much to occur to just put the volume in. And I think that it seems that the higher your intensity is per unit of volume, the less volume you can actually do. So if you're trying to grind 85 percenters, you might as well back down and grind 65 percenters instead, and you'll just get more volume for the same amount of fatigue. This makes at least as much sense during cutting as it does during massing. And I always get this pushback from the evidence-based, not the people in the limelight so much, well, I guess Lyle, but Lyle doesn't speak to me. He's got me blocked. I'm not the only one. My God. So I think this is like this trickling down from maybe Lyle's circle or something, in which every time I post sets of 12 on a cut, people are like, why don't you just do sets of 6 to conserve muscle better? I don't think there's anything in the literature that says athletes while cutting should be propping up their intensities at the expense of their volumes. As a matter of fact, I think the only reference I've ever seen is that in basically a taper paradigm situation, maintaining intensity maintains muscle in an isocaloric or eucaloric state, not in a hypocaloric state, and not in physique athletes. So, do you guys want to tackle that at all, or is that just not the time or the place?
I'll claim a little bit of responsibility for that, because back in like 2010, 2011, 3DMJ kind of said, hey, you know, like we think tension is the main stimulus, and, you know, you can't perform as much and volume is more fatiguing, so drop it back and just keep your loads the same. But that is something we've reversed our position on for the exact reasons you mentioned, as the role of volume became more clear. I think a good paradigm to look at it is that the load on the bar is indicative of whether or not you are successful in growing, but the total work you're doing is probably what's causing it. And I think that wasn't as clear of a position, 5-6 years ago. So I'll take some responsibility for that. The rest I'm going to blame on Lyle. And Lyle does talk to me, and that's your fault, Lyle. I'm talking to you, buddy. So, yeah. So I would largely agree with everything that Mike just said.
Cool. That was easy. Shit. I thought this was going to come to blows, Eric. I was going to be like, what? Where's the next flight to New Zealand? Because I'm getting on that plane. They'll ask me at the customs, they're like, what is your purpose for New Zealand? I'm like, I'm here to fist fight. And they're like, oi, man, that's cool. Or that was an Australian accent. Whatever, it's all the same. Anyway.
Was that an Australian accent?
Oi, man, fuck off, cat. Tell me that's wrong. Tell me that's not Australian.
I'm just going to let the Australians respond in the comments of this video.
That's right. That's right. Okay, so sorry, real quick. Actually, my position is very, very short on nutrition and deloading. I think it has to reflect the goal of the phase to some extent, but I think fundamentally the safest bet for nutrition during a deload is right around isocaloric. If you are let's just use extremes. If you're very hypercaloric during a deload, you've brought down the stimulus for adaptation. You've brought down your energy expenditure. What the fuck are you smashing 7,000 calories a day for? Where's that shit going? Recovery is not like a linear process where the more food you eat, the more recovered you are. Then like the world's fattest man would be recovered as hell. That would be sweet. Like he can hit 1,000-pound squat for 10 any day because he just eats so much. That's just not how it works. So past there was a very asymptotic relationship. Actually, Steve, one of your graphics illustrate this really well, that you had on Instagram where it's like recovery versus excess calories, and it kind of slopes off at some point, right? So isocaloric's a really good bet. Broderick Chavez has a good idea that in the first couple of days of that deload microcycle, you still have a lot of muscle growth going on, a lot of trauma from your last peak microcycle. So you might go to slightly hypercaloric in those few days, but after that, bring it down. On the other hand, this is a really, really big point. When you are dieting, the purpose of a deload is to drop fatigue. If you are still, to the extent that you are hypocaloric, you have taken your best weapon of fighting fatigue next to sleep and relaxation and just removed it altogether. So if the purpose of the deload is to drop a fatigue, you had better not be at least very hypocaloric. Some level maybe. My safe bet is to just be isocaloric, get it at the maintenance level of calories during the deload to make sure that you have the support system to actually drop. What I've seen with a lot of competitors that I used to coach more back in the day, competitors and just regular people cutting, they'll be like, all right, I did my deload. And I'm like, did you up your calories just a bit to stay in maintenance? They're like, no, I dieted all the way through that shit. And you're like, great. Like, I wasn't going to say, did you lose muscle? Because, you can only lose so much muscle at a time, et cetera. If it's extreme conditions, they could lose quite a bit. But let's say the muscle loss isn't even a big concern. I'm like, how do you feel? And they're like, I feel like shit. I'm going to die. And like, great, you're totally ready for another mesocycle. You did this completely well, right? That's ridiculous. So I think going to maintenance, maybe just a bit, above or below, like Eric said, based on situations, I think it's good. But I think you start to come up against a really big argument either way. If you're super hypercaloric during a deload, you got a lot of explaining to do. If you're super hypocaloric during a deload, you have a lot of explaining.
Awesome. And Menno, if you got some comments, how are you structuring your nutrition over your deloads, or well, over your recovery days? It depends whether or when you do take the full deload.
Yeah, I fully agree with Eric and Mike here. Like for reactive deloads, I don't have any change in nutrition. I think it's far more important to have a meal plan and maintain your dietary habits than to worry about day-to-day changes in energy expenditure that are really trivial. And I could go on a big rant about the Fitbit here, but I'll leave that for a different time.
Yes, please. No.
And I mean, the difference in energy expenditure is really trivial, doing a few lat sets or skipping one exercise. So I think it's not worth bothering with. And like Mike said, in the event that I do structure longer days off, then I think you have some serious recovering to do, and then you're going to need that energy to actually recover well, probably. So I don't see any point in, if someone takes a whole week off, then it's probably, or if someone takes a week or more off in my kind of programs, then it's probably because they have a serious injury or potential for a serious injury. Then I maybe taper the calories down a little bit, so I don't want them getting fat, but that's about the extent of it.
Perfect. No, go for it, Mike.
Sorry to interject. Menno, can you seriously please go on a Fitbit rant, man? People need to hear this shit, man. You don't know how many questions we get about this kind of stuff. My Fitbit says I burned 8 trillion calories yesterday. I had a pizza to accommodate. Seriously.
You know what's crazy to me is it's 2018. Do you guys remember when the Body Bug came out and every 24-hour fitness trainer had those? That was like 2007. And the amount of accuracy between the Body Bug a decade ago and the Fitbit today hasn't improved at all. I don't understand.
This is the same shit. I mean, what can you measure? Like, it's like heart rate and wrist movement. I mean, how accurate can it get?
Yeah.
So really just a proxy for masturbation habits at this point.
Oh, you got it on that arm. Man, I can have so many more calories.
Right? You're like, I'm burning 8,000 calories. Turns out that the sheer ferocity and volume of your masturbation actually does burn 8,000 calories. And your coach is like, holy shit. He loses a lot more weight on the days in which he, Pornhub. No one? Anyone? I personally don't engage in such illicit activities because I'm a moral individual. But you folks, you Europeans and New Zealanders or whatever, and Steve, God knows what kind of freaky shit the English are into.
But they feel guilty, though. That's the good
side
of
course.
English, or at least they feel guilty about it, so they're self-deprecating. So that's all right.
Yeah.
Is that what the M stands for in MRV? I just got it.
Masturbation, receptacle, vagina. We're looking for where the term is in the works. We're going to be reaching out to our colleagues in the Netherlands because they're experts of everything fetish. So
anything desecrate.
Actually, fuck. Super quick story. This is Greg Knuckles' story. Greg was traveling to a conference that some of us did in the Netherlands, and he's like, he's going through customs, and like the visa process is really annoying and shit. So you don't want to say like, oh, I'm here for business, because they're like, where's your tax form and all shit. So he's like, fuck. What am I going to say? Like, why am I here? Because I'm only a day in for a conference. That's weird. Should I just say I'm a tourist? And the guy in line of customs right in front of him in the Netherlands, they're like, what are you doing in the Netherlands? And he's like, I'm here to fuck hookers and do drugs. And they're like, welcome to the Netherlands. Give him a passport. And Greg's like, holy shit. He's like, I'm here for a conference. They're like, welcome to the Netherlands. Whatever, man. I was like, wow, that guy is my fucking personal hero. The man who was on a mission and told people about it.
And he had to deload after that.
Of course.
Take home message: honesty pays off.
That's right.
Well, guys, I don't want to hold you too long. I know we already were delayed coming on, and it's been absolutely amazing having you on the podcast for this kind of discussion more than anything. Which I think overall, whenever you see kind of these debates, named debates, they're very often discussions, and that's the great thing about all of the individuals who I've had on the podcast, and you guys have all been on. You completely respect one another, and it just shows, and I think that's fantastic. And there is no kind of massive black and white controversies, because that would be ridiculous because you're all basing it off evidence and off your own experience. So no, thank you so much for coming on, and hopefully, and maybe, depending on kind of your guys' schedules, we might be able to kind of have some further roundtables in future, discussing various aspects of hypertrophy and kind of physique development and that sort of thing, because I think it's just so beneficial for people to hear you guys discuss it, because I think often the public can be kind of a bit confused and they think that it is black and white between everyone's like approach, but evidently it's not. So yeah, thank you so much for coming on and spending the time with me and one another.
Thanks for having us.
My pleasure, man.
Thanks, Steve.
Cheers, guys, and we'll catch you all soon. And make sure you share this podcast around because it needs to be seen. I think deloads are one of the areas at which people get very, very confused about. And it's really, in reality, like a lot of the things we've discussed here, it's not that confusing a topic. So thank you guys for listening.